Well, welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Voisin, the host of Inside Personal Growth. And joining me from New Hampshire on the other side of the country, because I'm here in San Diego, is Thomas Moore. And we're going to be speaking about Thomas's new book. You want to hold that up,
Oh,
Thomas?
yeah,
Just
sure.
so we have just came out today. Thomas Moore, The Eloquence of Silence, Surprising Wisdom and Tales of Emptiness. And it is really a wonderful book. And I want my listeners, we'll put a link to the website. You can go to thomasmooresoul.com, and that's Moore. Thomasmooresoul.com is a place to learn more about Thomas Moore. Thomas, not all my listeners know you, even though you've been on the podcast a couple of times before. I'm going to tell them a tad bit about you first before we get started. And he's the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Care of the Soul. He has written 24 other books about bringing soul to personal life and culture, deepening spirituality, humanizing medicine, finding meaningful work, imagining sexuality with soul, and doing religion in a fresh way. In his youth, he was a Catholic monk and studied music composition. He has a PhD in religious studies from Syracuse University and was a university professor for a number of years. He's also a psychotherapist influenced by J.C. Young and James Hillman. And the list goes on and on and on. But that's a good introduction. Believe it or not, James Hillman's son, who lives in St. Louis, has been on my show many times talking about the archetypes. He's a wonderful, I'm going to even call him young man because he's younger than me.
Yeah, yeah. He's a great guy.
Yeah, I'm sure that you know him. You know, I found reading this book and the quotes that you did and then the stories you gave to be really quite interesting. And you start the introduction of the book off about making this trek that we were just talking about before we got on the air, going all the way across the country. And at this point, it was to Portland, Oregon, to talk in a book signing. And you're saying now you don't have to do that. You just come on these Zoom calls and do this. But for the book, The Care of the Soul, I remember reading, you got into the bookstore. The guy said, well, people are coming. Sometimes they're late. You sat there. And an hour later, you waited over an hour and no one showed up for your talk. And the guy said, well, I guess maybe we ought to cancel it, right? So you walked back to your hotel in reflection of the evening's events. And you mentioned that this is a story of emptiness and not to be attached to kind of an outcome. It's like we can all, from a Buddhist standpoint, get attached to these outcomes. What would you want the listeners to take away from that little introductory story about you going to a book signing where no one showed up?
Well, I think that's a very good example of emptiness in practice. It's actually happening. And that was an event in my own life that I've never forgotten because it was my first bookstore appearance. And I didn't know anything about it. And I had my doubts about the book anyway. I didn't really, I kept asking my agent if I'd have to pay back the advance I got because I didn't expect anyone to buy it. And but it turned out to be pretty good. But I got to that store and it was empty, really, and empty in the sense that no people showed up. So I think that's what I'd like to have that as the opening story of this book because emptiness is just part of ordinary life. And if you have this in your mind, empty, that emptiness can show itself in all different ways, and it doesn't have to be negative.
It's
The idea is not to be negative.
Yeah, and I think that emptiness, loneliness, different things. Um, but you talked about this great spiritual teacher, and I don't want to mess up his name, Nasrudin, Nasrind.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I've heard different versions, but I think I say Nasruddin. Yeah.
Nasruddin.
Yeah.
In your chapter, and you called this the missing ring. I'd love you to relate the story to the listeners and what place that emptiness has in our relationships.
Okay, well, the story is a very simple one, like all these stories. There are many of them about
Yeah,
Nasruddin.
they're all
He's
simple.
he's kind of a character, a set character, and usually he's a teacher. And he's living in a village, and one of the villagers comes to him and says, "I've been studying with you all these years, and it's meant so much to me. But now I've been called to go and move to another place altogether. And I was thinking, when I've seen you wearing this ring on your finger. And I thought that if you would give me that ring and I wore it on my finger, then every time I looked at it when I was away, I'd be reminded of you." And Nasruddin, who in other stories is not usually willing to give up too much of his own possessions, he says, well, I have a better idea. He says, why don't I keep my ring? And now every time you look at your finger and there's no ring there, you'll think of me. So I think that's a perfect story of emptiness. There you are, you have the mind, as many of us do, to have something. We want something. We want things all the time. And instead of having something, we have nothing. And the nothing is the teacher says, is more effective than the something. I think that's a perfect story. What I'm trying to get at here, that emptiness can bring a lot of benefits to us. Not having something, not saying something, not getting anywhere, all these things, not knowing something, forgetting, all of these experiences that are part of daily life can be useful to us if we could see them that way. If we could get out of the modern way of seeing all emptiness as being an absence and a lack and something negative. I think these stories tell us to appreciate the emptiness when it comes into our lives.
Yeah, it is a kind of an odd thing living in the Western world. And I won't say just the Western world. I think much of the world today is filled with something. In other words, there's always something or there's something more. And as you know, being a psychotherapist, I've done so many of these interviews where it's like, okay, well, you're going to get rid of the ego. Well, you're not going to get rid of the ego. The ego is always going to be there. It's always going to be telling you you're maybe not enough or you're doing whatever. But when it comes to us, our society, filling us with always saying there's got to be something more, right? That we need something more, that it drives our economy, it drives the world. What would kind of be your comment on that? Because that's, in one sense, that is not emptiness. That's saying, okay, here's something that's going to satisfy you. And almost 100% of the time, it never does.
Yes, it doesn't satisfy. Because I think the main reason is that the ultimate object of desire is beyond imagining. It's very mysterious and profound. So all these other desires we have and the satisfaction of them don't satisfy because they point to something greater, something bigger all the time. And actually, I feel that this idea of emptiness, which is elaborated and discussed a great deal in the Eastern world, the Eastern spiritualities, is actually takes you there faster than something. Not having something will take you there faster. Now, you mentioned that I was a monk for a number of years. That was a long time ago when I was a young man. And I love that life. And there was a lot of emptiness in it. There was a lot of quiet, which is the emptying speech. There was a lot of quiet and silence. And there was little ownership. We had a vow of poverty, actually no ownership really, not worrying about things and gathering things. So I lived from the very beginning a life of considerable emptiness, and I found it very joyful. I found that was great. And I try to bring as much of that into my current life as I can.
Well, it also reflects in the books that you write, right? So when you look at someone's journey, it's always interesting to look at a journey and see where they went as a result of you being this monk, you know. And you have a chapter about the lost arrow and the great master archer, And in this story, it's a very good example about the empty bowstring and how to exercise the power and be effective in the world. And I remember, this archer saying, "Hey, let's go see the master bow, the master who's out there shooting arrows into the air, but there's no arrow in the bow." Um, can you tell the story and how sometimes it's more effective to be quiet instead of speaking in this case? It was a great story. I loved it because it's like, hey, how's this guy shooting birds out of the sky?
Well, just quickly, the story is about a man who was a teacher of archery, and his students told him that they heard about this wonderful other teacher that was archer up in the mountain. So they all went up to the mountains to behold and see this great archer. And when they got there, they saw this elderly man on the mountain, and he had a few of his students around him, and he had a bow in his hand, but he had no arrow to be seen anywhere. And as he was teaching, this bird flew over, and he pulled his bow back, but there was nothing there, no arrow, and he released nothing, and the bird came down. And so the newer teacher who had come there was amazed and decided to become his student. And the whole point was that he was able to have a weapon, or you might say a piece of technology, something that he could normally would be used in a certain way with a bow and arrow, obviously. And nothingness in his case was more effective. I think that's really back to our theme of being able to do something without much. I'll tell you an example in my own experience is I find that many times when I give talks that I don't go out on the stage with any notes in my hand. Sometimes I put them in my pocket, but I don't take them out of my pocket. And sometimes if there's a green room or a place I can be by myself before a talk, I will sit there and try to empty my mind so that when I go out on the stage, it's empty. I did that once in a Unitarian church, and I didn't do it with much intention. That's just something that I always do, and it was in nearby my home. I wasn't worried about it too much. I don't know why, but I wasn't. And I gave this talk for an hour without any notes or any preparation, really. And when it was over, these people came up to me and they asked me to join their organization, which was some sort of international association of giving talks without notes, of speaking without preparation. I didn't think of it as a thing. I thought of it as just the way I want to do it. In other words, my way of doing it was empty, but their way wasn't. It wasn't very empty. One of the things I say in this book over and over again is that emptiness itself has to be empty. When you do this, you can't do it in such a way that you're playing a trick on someone.
Right.
It's not sleight of hand. It's got to be pure in a way. You really have to do it. So whatever it is that you do in an empty way, just do it. And I think the effect is going to be surprisingly powerful, just as it is in the story of the bow.
When you say that without notes, it to a degree, somebody of a spiritual nature can rely on a higher power to actually have the flow come through them. I know when I've written my books, if I sit without distraction, and I always say a book flows through you, and I would probably say most good writers, that's how it does happen. Whether you sense it or hear it, or you get a voice, or you get a feeling, or whatever it might be. And that's what you're saying when you approach the stage without the notes. You literally just allowed the essence of Thomas More to come through, but in essence, more likely a higher power than Thomas More, which is what makes it so powerful, the talk.
Yes, and to do that, you have to do what in Christianity is called kenosis. That's their word for emptying. In Buddhist and more other Eastern spiritualities call it shunyata, that kind of emptiness. The Christians call it kenosis, which really means a particular kind of emptying, which is an emptying of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that just what you said, I've had that experience, for years, that the only book that can be written is one that I get out of the way, where I get out of the way, and the book is written. Something else.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing. One of the teachers in book writing will say, just write as much as you can, and don't reread what you've written. Right. In other words, just keep writing. And then when you're ready to edit, go edit and do what you're going to do. Everybody's got a technique, but it all comes around, like you say, emptying. The emptier you can be, the greater I'm going to say channel you can be to have sacred energy come into you and through you to make this happen. And you mentioned that you're inspired to allow empty space all over your life, times for doing nothing, gaps for daily gaps in your daily schedule, not going to a place where you were asked, encouraged to go, saying no to a job offer you wrote in the book. If you would talk to the listeners about creating empty space, because there's this thing in the modern world today called FOMO, fear of missing out. And when you look at this device that most people carry today, this is probably the quintessential fear of missing out device, because I call it downhead syndrome. That's my thing, because I've actually had people run into me looking at this device and have no awareness of their space at all. And their head certainly isn't empty. Um, what would you try and tell people that are going to live their lives and practice more of this versus, always looking to this FOMO, the fear of missing out, that there's something that's going to come across that phone that I really have to have, which in essence we know is totally impractical.
The version of that I run into in my work is a fear of not knowing something. There are a lot of people that I know who, like, let's say in the medical world or in the psychology realm, who believe that they should know everything, that when someone asks them a question, they better have the answer to it. And I think that's a good place where emptiness can come along. I remember once working with a man who was a psychiatrist, and he spent most of his time getting credentials in everything you can think of, to fill up his I guess his education. He obviously felt insecure about what he knew and what he was capable of. And I felt that filling up was just the wrong direction to go. He should have sat with his emptiness, sat with his ignorance, and be able to be ignorant when people asked a question. You could say, well, I'll look that up, or, that's one thing I've never thought about. You can kind of go with the emptiness by acknowledging your ignorance about something. And that's another version of emptiness that I think could be very effective, very helpful for many people today, if they can practice it, give it a try.
Well, they're trying to fill up something because something, I think, and I'm not going to psychoanalyze, is missing. And you had the empty plate story again with the same character. I thought that relating this story would be good for the listeners, and the message you were conveying about pseudo emptiness. In other words, I think that, that this was a great story in the book, and it relates to what we were just talking about. So you want to comment about that, if you would, or tell the story
Sure,
and then comment?
sure. Just briefly.
It's a very short
Right.
story. It's very short.
It is. Nasruddin and a village official were having dinner together, and the official was didn't like Nasruddin, and at at the end of the meal, these melons were served for dessert, and the man, the official, ate his melons and had his peels on his plate, and he poured them over on to put them on Nasruddin's plate. And then he said to Nasruddin, he said, "You're a glutton." And Nasruddin looked at his plate and he said, "Yes, but at least I didn't eat the rinds." And I think that that story is another empty story, because this man's plate was empty, but it wasn't empty in that good sense, in that sense of real emptiness. It was more that he was using it. And when you do emptiness that way, it doesn't work. It's like people might say, "Oh, I really don't know anything. My education has been not as good as I wish it had," and that sort of thing. That kind of looking for pity with your emptiness, what you don't know, is not empty.
Right.
It's
Right.
not, because you're manipulating the situation. So one way to see where emptiness is absent is when you're manipulating something, because that itself is a kind of filling in rather than allowing the emptiness just to be.
Yeah, I mean, I know in your having been a monk, you spent many days in silence, and I know for us out here, I go to a meditation. I try to go as often as can. It's a retreat in the Orcas Islands, and I'm reflecting on this right now because I'm going to go in August. And we spend 3 days in complete utter silence. And it's interesting how you have to kind of gradually come down into silence and emptiness. And then when you leave this retreat, and I think many people listening can relate, and you go back to what is considered, quote, the real world, you're in shock. You're like, oh my gosh, is this the world that I live in versus this world I was just in, where I spent time in meditation, in contemplation, emptiness, um, you know, even evenings where there's not a meal, right? Like, because everybody's used to eating an evening meal, right? So I found that empty plate story really compelling. And you also talked about the Gospel of Thomas. You tell the story about the leaky sack where the woman's carrying a sack full of grain and slowly she walks home. The sack has a hole in it. And when she arrives back home, she discovers it's empty. Now that's the story that Jesus told. But if you would speak with us about the message about the empty sack and the message Jesus was conveying through that leaky sack story, I really enjoyed that story.
I love that story. It's from the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas is perhaps the earliest gospel we have. And it's a gospel of sayings of Jesus, and not too much happens, but there are a lot of stories. And in this story, I think what's key about the story is that it's the main image is of an empty sack. There's nothing left in it. And this is the story about what the kingdom is like. That means the way of life that Jesus is promoting in his teaching. It's empty, really. There's nothing there. And that's not the way it's happened in history. We, instead of being empty, we've had huge churches. And as I say in there, we have, in one of the stories, we have so many sermons have been given over the centuries that probably we'd be better off if they just had been silenced. There's just so much. How many political speeches would we be better off if they hadn't been given? There's just way too many words in our world. That's another way silence is offended. We're not benefiting from it. So this story of emptiness, I think, is really important for people who follow the way of Jesus, which is to realize that there's a certain poverty of spirit that he typically teaches that is very close to emptiness. So if you can not have to be, like he says, you don't have to be in charge. Be the servant. Don't be, you're not first, be last. That kind of thing is an emptying out of the self that goes on over and over again. I think that's one of the key teachings of Jesus, and yet it's one that is as far as I can see, it's not either preached, taught, or practiced. So I think we're missing out something there.
Well, it was interesting you say that because as you're talking about it, I remember my son and I, my son got leukemia, and we decided to come together and do work together. And we created a course called Never Mind the Noise, Thriving in a World of Ever Increasing Complexity. And, we would go out and we would go into this world of, let's just say, like you said, travel somewhere and then put on this workshop for people who'd never meditated, never been mindful, never did anything. And what happened is the workshop got so massive, people coming from all over, because these UPS people and these people from FedEx, logistics people would come to these meetings and they go, you got to go to that seminar that Voisin's doing, because we actually got to spend 15 minutes in silence, right? They had never experienced 15 minutes of silence. So they didn't know what it was like because their life was always full. It was always full of something, especially I'm using the logistics community, but we did many. You can imagine what it's like to run something like a FedEx or a UPS. It's always time. We got to get something here. We got to get it there. We got to do this, got to do that. And so it was quite a benefit to these people to start a new practice of, hey, if I could at least just silence myself in the morning for a little bit, and my day would go easier. It would go better. It would be more peaceful. Now, you recite a poem by Roa Ken.
Yeah.
In the poem, he talks about the stringless lute that can only be heard by the deaf person. And again, I love the analogy. Your father was a great musician, and you learned to play piano, and you also realized that your father had perfect pitch. Um, I drive myself, I drive my wife crazy because she's a piano teacher, and right across the hall from me here, she said, "How long are you going to be on your podcast today? Because I got to get to the piano."
Yeah. Yeah.
So, um, but you use the story to relay the fact that quiet is a form of emptiness and is important for people who need to reflect and remember. And you say, in our noisy world today, what you teach is so important. What practices can make us more aware of emptiness, silence, and the benefits of having this in our lives? What are those practices that can help us actually flip the switch to knowing that having more emptiness and more, you call it the eloquence of silence, where the eloquence of silence would benefit us more? What are some of them?
Well, they're pretty basic and simple. One obvious is to be able to go for a walk in nature. I'm currently working on a book on Henry David Thoreau, and he that was one of his basic teachings, telling people to walk. And he tells you that when you walk, go outside your door, open your door, and don't decide where to go, just go. That's part of his idea. And I think it's such a wonderful thought that, again, see, that's empty. It's like you're empty of intention. And you go for a walk and you just go, and you're not heading anywhere. Like there's no destination for you. You're just walking. And he calls it sauntering. You're going along, and I think that would be a very simple practice that anyone could do. It's so basic. It's so simple.
Yeah.
Just go for a short walk if you want, just a short walk, and go into some form of nature, no matter where you live, at some form, a park or someplace, and maybe near water. One of the teachers I have from the Italian Renaissance says you should walk by sparkling water. That's his particular recommendation. And I think
Well,
that's a
if you're near a lake or a stream,
yeah.
in my case, I'm literally like 2 miles from the Pacific Ocean. So, I mean, taking a stroll on the beach or at least near the beach, it's one of my favorite things to do.
Sure.
What are some of the other things that the listeners might want to do?
Well, I'm a great believer in the arts as having intention, having a purpose in life, the arts. So I think you can learn a great deal about emptiness from the arts. If, let's say, you go to an art gallery or an art museum, they're usually pretty sparse and quiet, and if you really get into the spirit of the place, And if you go and let the paintings, if it's a visual art museum, let the paintings guide you, take you, rather than go with a lot of intention. I don't recommend art education for this particular purpose. The art education is for something else. In this case, I think it's more important to have a real encounter with a piece of art or a piece of music. And if you do that, that would be good preparation for being in life where you are more active, like let's say in your work or in relationships and things like that. If you are doing it in art and in nature, you will have been practicing it so that when it comes to the real world situations, you know what you're looking for and you can tap into that.
Well, I've always been a person, and I think based on what I can see from your pictures on the website, you love the outdoors, but, gardening, right? So I always say I found this wonderful show called Garden Chronicles on Netflix, which, these people have huge estates with these gardens that are massive in Pennsylvania and all these other states. But I actually have friends who belong to these gardening clubs, and they just go and they sit in these gardens and they sit and look at nature and the bees and the birds and listen to the birds sing. And I think it is so natural, not unnatural, to be in that silence, to be in nature like that, because that's what nature teaches you, is the importance of that. And in your chapter, Nothing is Natural, you cite Suzuki. And I'm going to paraphrase the quote because it's just a little bit too long, but it says, true being comes out of nothingness, moment after moment. Nothingness is always there. And from it, everything appears. You go on to state that the person who is forever scheming inside their head appears neurotic. Too many layers of intentionality. How can we allow our thoughts and actions to arise from nothingness, from an empty place, so we are not perceived as being, in this case, you said, untrustworthy? Because the reality is that somebody who's always scheming can have that appearance.
Well, yeah, I think everyone understands this. If you are engaging in conversation with someone, you can tell when they have some agenda going on, something is going on. They want to impress you, or they want to win. They want to win an argument with you, or they want to persuade you to something. Often there's something going on, and that means, when I say that there's something going on, what we want is nothing going on. If we're doing this with emptiness. So if you could be with someone and you realize, oh, there's no agenda here. I just feel like this person's really here and I can trust the situation. We can be closer in our conversation because there's emptiness at the root. There's nothing where, when a lot of conversations, there's something. There's some manipulation going on, or at least some effort to try to control you or persuade you. And if you are with someone and you don't feel that, you are sensing emptiness, and that creates trust.
Yeah, and I think when you are doing that, you're kind of manipulating the conversation. In other words, it's having that agenda ahead of time versus just being present and being with somebody. They always used to say, well, they're just waiting for someone else to talk, right? In other words, it was like, okay, so what's the next person going to say, versus there being a great pause of silence. There's always this uncomfortableness with great pauses of silence, because people aren't used to it. They're like, well, if Thomas just sat there right now and on the other end of this camera there was nothing, then people would be like, well, where the hell did he go? What happened to him, right? On the other hand, there is a beauty that comes out of that, and an importance, and that's what we're trying to say. And I like this one because this is the one where the chapter is there is no driver. You tell another story about Nasruddin and riding in a double-decker bus in London, goes to the upper deck, and then he looks around and he sees there's nobody there. He comes down to the lower level. The ticket collector says to him, "What's the problem?" He replies, "There is no driver up here. You mentioned that to listen to the dreams of others almost every day. You do. You said you listen to the dreams of others every day. What is familiar about the story and our unwillingness to let someone else drive, and our need to be in control and be the driver? You know, because when you analyze dreams, if you were a psychotherapist and at some point in your life and you were talking with people and talking with them about their dreams, you would hear most of the time that people had to be in control.
Yes, and I hear a lot of dreams about vehicles of all kinds,
Yeah,
especially automobiles, but also bicycles and motorbikes and trains and planes. You hear a lot of vehicle dreams, and many of them, the dream is focused on particularly on who's driving and where the dreamer is. Like, let's say if you have an automobile dream, a big issue is where is the dreamer sitting? Where, where is and who is driving, if anyone is driving? Sometimes there's no driver.
right.
And, and so all of that is very, very significant. You can imagine the complicated and deepening conversation that can come from a dream like that, because we're talking about who's in charge and who's in control of what's going on here. And people are very interested in that because that's a big part of life. Can I be out of control? Is that okay? Can I let this person be in charge or not? In marriage, you say, can I let my partner be in charge and make some decisions? Can I feel okay with that?
Yeah.
A lot of that is then you see it's kind of comes together in a dream of a car when you're driving. So I think the story of Nasruddin being in the bus is a very good one. And also, I like the idea of the fact that it's about there's no driver up there, up high. It's like so many people want someone in heaven driving your life or something. Someone's in charge. And if someone says, well, maybe there isn't, maybe there are no puppet strings, maybe there's nothing actually driving your life. Can you live that way? Can you live without having someone in charge? Can you let go of controls for a while? Those are all very big questions in anyone's life.
Well, you bring up a really important point. And for those of you out there who haven't watched the movie called Still about Michael J. Fox and his Parkinson's disease and the fact that he's been living with it since his early 30s and hiding it and trying to stay in control, and now is at a point where the Parkinson's is fully taken over. It gives you a perspective of, if you think about Michael J. Fox, he's raised $1 billion for the study on Parkinson's. And the reason it's called Still is because he so much wants to be still, but the tremors are just so crazy that he can't stay still. But it's that incident in his life that he had to learn and go through and depicts it, allowing others, even to this day, he doesn't like anyone to be in control. He still doesn't like it, even though he could use more of the help. It's always been part of his personality. He is the driver. And he admits that he's the driver and he realizes the faults of being the driver. But the reality is he hasn't learned how to let go of control. And I think there's a lot of people like that in this world, Thomas.
Yes, I think that's true. But I think if you listen closely to his story, that he has come to, it's like I was saying before about making sure your emptiness is empty. He has allowed I think to some extent, my impression would be that he's allowed his need for control to be emptied by his
Right.
Parkinson's.
Right.
So not that he doesn't have it, but empty in this sense, that this emptiness we're talking about is not literal. It's not like getting rid of something.
Right.
It's having a certain hollowness in the center of it, that it doesn't have that ultimate power over you that it would have otherwise. You still can go along living life the way you do, and it can be empty, even though it doesn't look empty. It's all a matter of how you deal with it.
And also I think how, if you care about how the outside world sees you, the perception, but the reality for you is that these practices, the walks in the park, the meditation, the things that you can do to quiet your mind, but more important, stay in this eloquence of silence, that really can deliver you to a whole new place in your life if you give it the opportunity to be there. And this book is filled with great stories, wisdom, advice, sound advice about the fact that silence is a great teacher. As a close to our interview, what advice would you like to leave our listeners with about cultivating a life with more silence, emptiness, and simplicity?
Well, one thing, first of all, is that you have to understand that this is not the way of the world that we live in.
No,
And,
it is not. No.
and so I think if you really want to give this a try, you have to be willing to be a word I've been using for years and years, eccentric. You have to be outside the center of the circle
Yeah.
of common life here. And you have to be willing to be different and to do things in a different way. Actually, I find eccentricity to be very liberating because it means you're not then just complying with what everyone around you wants you to be and do. And that is tremendously liberating. And you don't have to overdo it in your eccentricity, but you can be an individual. And there's a very slight difference between really being an individual and being eccentric. And
I
being
find some of the most interesting people are eccentric, and I think that's because they're also extremely curious. And what I find interesting is I've done these hundreds and thousands, well, I'm over 1,000 interviews, that some of the most interesting people like yourself, I guarantee you're eccentric. You couldn't have written the kind of books that you've written without being that way. But I find that the dialogue that we have is much deeper, that it's more interesting, that it's something I'm interested in because I'm still on the journey. And I think every listener out there who's on the journey of return, is on the journey of some path of spirituality, needs to get a copy of your book. I mean, I'll put a plug in for it, because if you have a library of books and you really want to pick up a book and you want to like take a little bit deeper dive, can you hold the book up again? This would be a good chance to hold this brand new one. Today is the day.
right.
You can get this on Amazon. It's called The Eloquence of Silence, Surprising Wisdom in Tales of Emptiness. And it is, you've done a masterful job of weaving it together, or some other source helped you weave it together because you were listening. um, and we'll put it that way. But for all of you who are listening, uh, and you want to learn more about Thomas's books, The Care of the Soul, which he and I did an interview on, which is an awesome book, just go to Thomas Moore, Moore, Soul, Soul.com. There you can learn more about him, the books, connecting with him, courses, videos, all kinds of things that he has up there available to somebody that wants to take a deeper dive. And Thomas, namaste to you today. Thank you for
Thank you.
being my guest on Inside Personal Growth and taking the time to be with our listeners. Again, everybody, brand new book just broke today. Thomas Moore, The Eloquence of Silence. Thanks, Thomas. Any last parting words?
Only, Greg, that it's always a great opportunity for me to talk with you and to have a conversation like this that models what this book is about.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. As I've gotten a little bit older and wiser, I think I've gotten better at what I do.
I'm sure. Sure.
I probably haven't perfected the part about interruption, because I get some people on here that you kind of have to move along because you only have so much time. So sometimes I do have to interrupt, but I try not to. I really do. But I appreciate you so much. Thanks for being on Inside Personal Growth.
Thank you.